So the idea behind this panel, and I think you guys can appreciate this, is it's a complicated problem. I think we know that prescribed fire functionally is an extremely important solution to a very, very wicked problem. But there's a lot of perspectives, and there's a lot of, I think, stories and themes and ideas that we need to explore to get us to a place that Will had alluded to that probably existed with the native tribes and their relationship to the land, and what we are seeing, I think, in Western Australia. So that's a challenge for California. And I'll start with just very, very brief. The format here is going to be pretty informal. We've got about an hour and 15 minutes or thereabouts, and then lunch is going to be served. So we've got a little bit of leeway if the conversation carries over. But again, the idea here is we've got a lot of really interesting, unique kind of perspectives here on the panel. And I'll just give a very, very brief introduction to give you an idea of those perspectives. And then each of our panelists will have a 5 minutes or so to just kind of explore what they're thinking in their current situation and how prescribed fire is important to them and how they see the work ahead. So I'll start kind of at the biggest level of picture with Jason Kuiken, who's a forest supervisor on the Stanislaus National Forest. The Stanislaus is smack dab in the middle of the Sierra. It runs from the Stan watershed to the Merced watershed, and basically circumscribes Yosemite National Park. And as alluded to, they have been doing a lot of prescribed fire and prescribed fire at scale. And I'm really looking forward to Jason's take on that. And we've got Marshal Turbeville, who's a battalion chief in a field battalion, the River Battalion in Sonoma Lake Napa Unit out on the northern coast in Sonoma County. I first got to know Marshall maybe 20 or 25 years ago when he was thinking about going to graduate school. And I said, you could probably do a whole lot of real great work in your position now, and he does. Sarah Bishop, who after college basically had a career in fire suppression, has transitioned along an arc towards fire use and prescribed fire, and she's now the statewide burn boss for California State Parks. So we've got three sort of agency level folks. And then we've got Eli Goodsell, who's the preserve manager at Big Chico State Preserve outside of Chico. And that is a very large ecological preserve, kind of in the foothill belt. The area all burned up in the park fire just this last year. And hopefully we can address some of the opportunities that wildfires present looking forward. And then finally, we've got Zeke Linder, and Zeke's almost ineffable. I guess the best way to describe Zeke is he's independent, and he's very independently minded. But he runs he's got video. He's actually going to probably put this up on YouTube tomorrow. And I think he's really tapping into something that agency folks don't fully understand, which is we need to be communicating better. And hopefully you can provide some of that perspective. I don't necessarily think that there's a particular order to work from, but I guess we'll go with the order that I presented. So Jason, you first.
This is on. Okay. So again, Jason Kuiken, Stanislaus National Forest, and this question of prescribed fire and landscape management is not an easy one to answer, because there's not an easy answer, right? I mean, we're talking about landscapes that are millions and millions of acres in size. We're talking built environment between communities and critical infrastructure. We're talking about recreation areas and impacts to habitat for salmon or Pacific fisher, California spotted owl. All of those things mean that the way that we need to analyze and to engage members of the public, our partners, our employees, is not a what should we do tomorrow kind of question, right? I mean, it is a conversation that requires research on the QWRA space. It involves research on the owl and habitat space from Malcolm North and Eric Knapp. It requires understanding what people's values are and how to achieve those values in a different frame. And yet again, that scale conversation matters terribly. So in my office in Sonora, to take a little bit of a turn here, in my office in Sonora, there's some commissioned artwork from the 87 complex. Anybody ever heard of the 87 complex? I thought hands go up. So in 1987, on the Stanislaus National Forest, lightning storm came over and created a bunch of different fire starts. And so in that commissioned artwork and the accompanying poster, I finally stopped in 2020 and actually read it. I got to the Stanislaus in 2017. And it goes on about how many firefighters there were there and how many communities were affected, and holy cow, how much money was spent, and how many acres burned. It's 147,000 acres, right? I mean, that was commissioned artwork in 1987. That doesn't even get in the top 50 in California state history anymore. That's plain old significant. And so that change, and we can argue about what's caused some of that change, but what we have before us is this need to figure out what do we do from here on out. And what we do from here on out is to quantify the risks, those values on the landscape, to lean into science and research and to say, we need to do landscape scale management that's commensurate with wildfire. That's plain and simply. And so then that question becomes, how do you set up for prescribed fire at scale? Because I'm here to tell you that 50-acre burn units aren't going to get us there. What's going to get us there is 1,000-acre burn units, 5,000-acre burn units. But in order to get to that, you need to do some mechanical treatment first. You need to look at potential operational delineations or pods in a manner, and how do you start looking at those pod boundaries as your prescribed fire unit boundaries sometime in the future. And when you combine all of those things and engage the public, engage on that smoke conversation as well, you can get there. And it's not tomorrow, but it can be next year. It can be 3 years out. If you're deliberate in your approach, if you're deliberate in bringing research and the right folks to the table. And so that's my perspective to start.
Good.
I rarely use notes, but I'm going to try to stay on task today because I can talk about a bunch of stuff. So Cal Fire, we primarily respond to fires on private property, which is different than the federal agencies. And so to me, a prescribed fire and a wildfire as a fundamental process are the exact same thing. It only differs what the ignition source is. So we got to reestablish that relationship. And we talk about getting to scale. I talk about 3 hurdles. And as government agencies, we're different than a private landowner, but there's environmental compliance, whether that's NEPA, CEQA, whatever it is. We've got to figure out how to worry about all the birds and animals and water and everything, and figure out the process is to mitigate that. Then we need the resources and the funding. And Cal Fire, primarily as a fire department, we have more firefighters now and longer times of the year. So in theory, we have more resources. But for the firefighters in the room, I hate to say this, but we're not the best at prescribed burning sometimes. Because we've got to make it, home for dinner and get off shift the next day versus just let the fire do its process. So environmental compliance, having the resources and funding to do it, and the big thing's liability. So liability for a federal agency is different than a state agency, is different than a private landowner. So ultimately to me is how can we all work together, whether it's a wildfire unplanned or planned, work with the smoke, work with the vineyard industry, Australia, same thing. How can we get more acres burned naturally, historically, if that means mechanical treatment prior, because a fire is coming. And we just got to change how we look at that. That's my take on it with the 3 hurdles. And so whether it's Zeke doing the media messaging, getting the understanding out there, that all helps with liability, because maybe someone's not going to sue us for smoke ruining a birthday party or something. So everybody does their little part of it. We need the volunteers, we need the PBAs, we need community support, we need 1 acre burns, half acre burns, we need pile burning, we need the pods. You know how many times I've been on a pod boundary and I'll say to a firefighter, hey, we're fighting fire on a pod. And they'll be like, well, a pod's a portable thing you put stuff in when you want to move. I'm like, no, this is a pre-identified area. This is where we need to get the shady fuel break. So it all fits together. And like I said, I'll take it to my notes, but I'll pass it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Marshall. And thanks for having me here. I won't repeat what anybody's already said, but I think one of the biggest challenges is really getting across boundaries. And we really have to find ways to do that. I work for California State Parks, and we're reaching across boundaries right now, trying to develop MOUs. But the length of time it takes to do that is slowing the work along with the other compliance that we have for agencies. The other piece that comes with that is recognizing that there's different pathways to fire. So that's kind of the paradigm shift that I think we need in this state, including cultural fire, people coming from ecological backgrounds, welcoming them into the fire world, is a paradigm shift that I think will make a huge difference. And we've been really lucky to be the benefactor of the Cal Fire Workforce Development Grant, but another piece that I see missing is there's not a lot of jobs out there, or they're seasonal and permanent, intermittent. And so finding ways to make stable pathways for people that are training, who are interested and dedicated to this work. We have federal firefighters that aren't making overtime on some of our projects, they're not getting hazard pay, and like Will pointed out, it is a hazardous environment that we're in. So I think structurally, those are 3 things that I'd like to add to the conversation and move forward. And I'm just gonna put a plug in here for Trex's. Getting everybody at the table, getting a variety of stakeholders, meeting together, burning together, motivates the work across those boundaries, and we just need to keep that model and continue moving it across California. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. Eli Goodsell, I'm Executive Director of the Chico State Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve. Grew up around fire, was born and raised in Paradise, California. Came down to the Bay Area and worked for a number of years, then came back to manage watersheds in my home watershed area. Can you imagine burning more with prescribed fire in California than wildfires per year, acres? I can imagine it, it's pretty cool. But it's a generational challenge. Like it is the generational challenge. It's the work that I do, that's the purpose that I have, is bringing young people into doing this work. For those of you who have heard me speak, you probably heard me say this, but it's the Great Wall of China, the Panama Canal, the Hoover Dam combined times 10, right? This is the type of resources, this is the type of effort it's going to take to get to the scale that we need to steward the landscapes in ways that were done for time immemorial before colonization. And to get back to that, we're really going to have to think about this as a generational challenge. I'm excited. This week, my week's packed with just talking about fire and all over the state, and that's really exciting to see us progress just in the last 8 years that I've been in my position. But we're still kind of at the very beginning stages of this work. And one of the things that I'm recognizing with the campfire footprint, Dixie, every footprint we can talk about is the missed opportunities, but then also the current opportunities, like the park fire footprint that burned all of our 8,000 acre ecological reserve, is that we've got a ton of opportunity in and around the black. In the last 25 years, the equivalent, some of these are burning some areas, the same areas, but the equivalent of 24% of all of California land bases have burned. So we have a lot of black in California. We're going to continue to see these massive wildfires, and there's a lot of really great opportunity immediately after wildfire in the black during July, August, September, right, to burn areas, burn these pockets, burn these islands, and in the green that, talk about these fuel breaks that we have. I remember going up and looking at the Dixie fire and saying well, look at all this green that's budding up to, we can just light this in August and just rip right into the black, right? We've got, 10 miles of control line over here on top of this ridge. So there's a lot of opportunity with these wildfires that we're seeing, a lot of opportunity in workforce development, and really it's that pipeline to those careers that, what's exciting about my work is there's people that come in as freshmen in college and saying, you're gonna have jobs that aren't even invented yet, because that's where we need to get in California. to get to pace and scale and prescribe fire. And I'm excited to talk about it with you all today.
All right, hey, thanks everyone. Al's like being a cleanup batter, following all these great ideas. I was laying in bed last night and I was kind of angry. I was like, I gotta go to the meeting in Sacramento. It's a burn day. And I look around the room. I've got Dallas Kohler, I've got Eli, I've got myself. It's like we've got like, I don't know, 3 of the 4 burn bosses in Butte County are like here, and then the 4th is in Nebraska burning. And I was grumpy about that, and I wanted to make a big deal about it. But then I was thinking, then I heard Eli say that he's excited to go talk about fire to people, and I realized, well, as we build this capacity, he's got people who are burning piles for him today without him. I hope. And so we've been kind of resource limited, I think, and and that comes in many forms. That means you don't have enough burn bosses, or you don't have enough people that you trust to, clean up your piles. But that as we build capacity, it does increase capacity for someone like Eli to come spread the gospel. We're not all spread so thin. So that's exciting to me. I wanted to ask a question though. How many of you are familiar with the Moonlight Fire? All right. So when I think of all this capacity we're building, one thing that is frustrating is that we've got all these new burn bosses and we've got nowhere to play. We've got nowhere to go to work. And that's because the Stanislaus is the only forest that is burning at scale, maybe the 6 rivers. All of our local forests are completely, the Lassen, the Plumas, the Tahoe, completely closed off the idea of managing fire for resource benefit. Like following the Dixie Fire, you get on Facebook and Plumas National Forest is like, we put out a lightning fire on Kitty Ridge, and then there's all those comments like, hey, this is great, yeah, the Forest Service. And the only thing burning in the photo is the tree that they chopped down was on fire. It's in complete hard black. But they like send repellers or some smoke jumpers or something, risk their lives to drop them in to the middle of like 10,000 acres of hard black to put out a single lightning fire. So we can't count on our local Forest Service to burn at scale. And then the rest of the big players are the industrial timberland owners. And they're not burning anything. So the reason I brought up the Moonlight Fire is that I think when I think of barriers to expanding the use of fire, one, we're not going to get it all done with prescribed fire. We're going to have to manage a lot of fires for resource benefit. But two, that singular event of the Moonlight Fire has shut down all burning on private timberlands, pretty much across the board. Like almost no private timberland owners are even burning slash piles in the middle of the winter because their lawyers say this is too high risk. That's because the Moonlight Fire resulted, it was Sierra Pacific Industries bought a timber sale from Beatty, and Beatty's loggers Sierra Pacific's loggers started a fire. It became the Moonlight Fire, and then the Forest Service and the feds decided to go after Sierra Pacific Industries, and they sued them for $100 million, both for suppression costs and for the watershed damage caused by the Moonlight Fire. And they won, and so SPI had to sell 15,000 acres or something. They gave the Forest Service a bunch of land. But that precedent has stood now for the last 18 years, and that's the singular thing that has shut down burning on industrial timberlands. So for us to be able to burn at scale, for us, all of our new burn bosses that we're training up everything, to go out and actually do the work that we're training them to do, that's not gonna happen unless we figure out how to do something similar to the CARX program at the federal level. So CARX, Senate Bill 332, if I, as a state burn boss, write a burn plan and CAL FIRE signs off on it and says, yeah, you can go burn this, and I go and burn it, and it gets away and starts a wildfire. I, as a burn boss, am not liable for any suppression costs. And that was a big deal for us professionally. But until we have something like that, that absolves industrial timberland owners from burning and having an escape and then getting sued for $100 million, they see it as an existential threat. And so I think until we can talk about working at that scale, we can have meetings like this all day long, but it comes back down to it. It's like, liability is the singular issue that is keeping us from doing anything at any sort of scale. I got lots else, but I think I'll hand it off to someone else.
Don't stop.
Okay, just to kind of pull together all the threads that we've heard from everyone here. Burning the burn is the low-hanging fruit. And so that story I had about the Plumas putting out a lightning fire in the middle of 10,000 acres of hard black. We have this, prescribed fire is completely spatially explicit, right? So it's great for us map nerds, because any place you want to talk about doing a burn is unique, and we can't have blanket kind of policies. And it's the same with following up these fires and burning in the black. And these are fleeting opportunities. I went for a bike ride in the Dixie Fire the other day, and a lot of stuff that I've been thinking, yeah, we can burn, it's hard black, now has 4-foot tall brush in it. And so we've got these really fleeting opportunities to put fire into these low complexity, high reward landscapes. Coming back to the Moonlight Fire, it burned about 65,000 acres. There was a lot of low severity in that. It had a high proportion of high severity, but there were some really nice surviving stands that got kind of low severity on, when they weren't right in the path of the high severity fire. Unfortunately, we spent so much time planning, and the Forest Service spent so much time responding to burns by salvage logging, snagging roads, other work, that all these beautiful stands in Moonlight that we could have put fire into maybe 5 years after the burn and underburned them and cleaned up the dead down and everything else, completely nuked during the Dixie Fire. And so that window was closed. That interceding 14 years was too long to wait to get fire back into the Moonlight Fire. When it came back on a bad day, it killed everything that was left in there. Well, not everything, but a lot of the beautiful big old trees that survived the first fire didn't survive the second fire because of the wood that fell down in that 14 years. So burning the burn is important. It has to happen. We have to be thinking ahead of time. And when I hear that something's in NEPA, what I think is, that means basically that it's going to burn up in a wildfire before we get to it. Because the Dixie Fire burn projects that were restoration projects funded after the 2000 Story Fire, 21 years before. They burned up projects that were planned but never implemented in the Moonlight Fire. Every time we have a big wildfire that burns a previous fire, we burn up projects that are in NEPA that haven't gotten done. Anyway, just looking around the table here, I want to give a shout out to Eli. What I'm really hopeful for, working with the Chico State Reserves, like you said, we would pick up someone who's 18, 19 on their first burn, and 4 or 5 years later, they're like burn bossing a grassland burn. And it's super inspiring. I know now as a burn boss in Butte County that if the Chico State engine shows up, that I'm going to have a solid, not only am I going to have a solid 3 or 4 people to run that engine, but I can pull those people off and they can, if I needed to, they could be a division basically if I had a wildfire. So hugely hopeful in working with that, and I also appreciate that CAL FIRE's made that happen through these workforce development funds. And lastly, Jason's sense of history, this storytelling element. Wildland fire is a storytelling culture, and for us to figure out ways to communicate, to increase the fire literacy. I did an interview with Will Harling, and he said that knowing the fire history of the place that you live is more important than knowing how to read. And I think I agree with that.
Thanks for that, Zeke. I think you gleaned sort of the intent of the panel and having these really wide, varying perspectives. I'd like to mine a little bit on something. I'm kind of a technocrat. I've been working in risk analysis for a long time, working GIS, trying to find, where we have a problem. I don't know that risk, and I think it's good to do. I think the risk, quantitative risk assessments are solid, but that basically defines the demand part of the problem. And you can kind of throw a dart at California and chances are it could use some help. I think that where we're really struggling with is the opportunity side. I kind of co-opted microeconomics in a dream some years ago, where, you know, instead of the price curves of supply and demand, I thought about this sort of risk and opportunity. And the intersection of that is where we would have a landscape that we would be treating. Opportunity in California is difficult. Zeke just pointed out that commercial timber landowners are really not engaging in prescribed fire because of liability. Is there a legislative solution to that? Is there, how do we frame up the opportunity cost of not doing the work? Because we spend a lot of money putting out fire. We spend a lot of money having a lot of fire occur. Some of those acres are producing probably good outcomes. How do we reframe the economics and financial elements of this discussion? And again, I don't know, you know, is it as simple as a liability fund? Is it something larger? Do we build on some sort of a social storyline for the public to basically understand, again, if we keep going down the path that we're going to go down, we're going to have more, you know, more catastrophic fires. There's just no doubt about that. Does anybody want to, you know?
Yeah. Take a stab. So I have two things on that. One is the campfire. I kind of go back to that. That was the one that impacted my community that I grew up in the most. And I think about one of the projects that we're working on in kind of a remote area in the canyon of Big Chico Creek, and it was this remote area that was like $8,000 an acre to go out and treat, just because it took so long to get out there. It was high brush, all of these different things, which wasn't a whole lot of, like, it wasn't really economically feasible. But the campfire, the alternative, I think that after, you know, all the payments, insurance, all that, it was like $300,000 an acre, right? So that's the alternative. I look at our landscapes in California as, we know what the diagnosis is, and it's a fatal diagnosis. And we know what the medicine is, and the medicine's fire. But just like a diagnosis where you might have to have invasive surgery, there's a risk that's going to happen with that. But if we know what path we're going to go down without taking that risk, I think we would all take that risk, knowing that the diagnosis is fatal. And I think that that's the communication that we need to have with the public and continue having, is the dollar piece, but then also really that we're on a trajectory of more towns burning down, our forests burning down, our kids not being able to go camping and being at the clean water, our fish, you know, going extinct. And recognizing that there is risk, and there are going to be, I mean, unfortunately, there are going to be homes that will get burned down in prescribed fire. I hope that I don't light it, but that's going to be the case. And I think that's a hard conversation to have with the public, but we need to be upfront, we need to be transparent, that if we're going to use the medicine that we need at the scale that we need to save our forests and steward our lands in the way that we need to, that's going to come with that inherent risk, and we need to prepare the public for that as well.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. It's a paradigm shift, and I think, like, it was so great to see all the PowerPoints today and see all the kids at the end. And my 13-year-old went to his first prescribed fire last year as well. I just had a conversation with Will about wanting or not wanting our children to follow her footsteps. But it's the paradigm shift, and I think, you know, I'm going to be hopeful and say that I am seeing that. And especially, I came from a suppression background, 2 decades in fire service, now working in the prescribed fire realm with agency work, and so I'm seeing that on the ground. So I think that's huge. I have young firefighters coming up to me saying, "Are you liking the fire effects you're getting?" I go out to do suppression and still work in suppression, and I see this tactics being employed. So I'm seeing that shift. So first it's the paradigm of the community. And it's funny, I actually thought of this because I think we write 21 element burn plans. There's 21 elements. And I want to add the 22nd element. And that's, what if we don't burn? We need to ask ourselves, what happens if we don't burn this? What does this look like? We have these amazing plans and all this stuff, and I think we need to start putting that into burn planning, or at least in that thought of like adding that element of, having the conversation of what happens if fire doesn't touch this ground. So that's just my thought.
All right, I'll just add a couple things. The opportunity cost, whether it's financial or ecological, I think that's what we're getting at here. The other things, the financial, the liability. I talk sometimes as a firefighter, we're about program and project management. We need to get into a program level management, and that also comes down to what is pace and scale. Is pace 1,000 burns a day, or is it 1 burn 1,000 acres? Like, what are we trying to achieve? Because I think we need both. And if that was more, we recognize water, the trees, wildlife, it's all a public benefit, fire's a public benefit, a natural process. How do we then find that funding where it's sustained, where we're gonna do so many fires every year, so many acres every year, if we wanna get to 5% or 4 million acres a year, how do we get there? That might help give the willing landowners, like the private timberlands, to get involved if they know that CAL FIRE's got their back from a suppression point of view, or local government, or the federal agencies. The liability's taken away, because I do think we can burn my home safely. Yeah, we probably will burn a home down at some point, but we can still do it safely. And another thing I'll just say is, we call it suppression, but I do a lot of prescribed burning during the summer when it's a wildfire. And you have enough firefighters here to reduce the risk, burn at 2 o'clock in the morning, not being worried about, hey, the firefighter's got to go to dinner at 5 tonight or go off shift in the morning because you got, food out of the fairgrounds. We get a lot done in the summer, and it's not all destructive on a wildfire. A black acre is not a black acre. It's not a binary event. We can mitigate that risk to do burning, and also I would hope to incentivize all the landowners, regardless of whether they're at 2 acres, quarter acre, wooey, or a large timber owner, and then we start ignoring the boundaries, supervisory districts, land ownership, and we go to more of just a program level management that we're all engaged on. And is there a day when, we don't know if there's gonna be a wildfire today, but we know for sure there's gonna be a prescribed burn today. If you live in Missoula, Montana, it's smoky. It's where 5 canyons come together. If you live there, you know it's gonna be smoky. We know it's California, we know it's a managing climate, it's gonna be smoky. Can we plan our days versus waiting for a wildfire? And if we just change how we look at it, I think that's where we gotta get to. Cal Fire summer fire season is summer prescribed burning season. We have a fall prescribed burning season, and a winter prescribed burning season. And if we're not burning, we're getting ready to burn. So I think we just gotta get to that program level and try to find out how we can take away some of those barriers too. Also research too, Dr. Stevens.
Yeah, so the 2 points I would make are building off of things that were just said, and one of those is that any reasonable alternative that we come up with will have less negative effects than wildfire most of the time, right? So that's one. And 2 is that on prescribed fire is most of the acres that we want to do prescribed fire on need some interim treatment, meaning some mechanical treatment first, because we're not in a situation where it can accept fire. Certainly in recently burned areas, you can do that, and in some areas that have seen treatment in the last 10 years, you can. And can you put fire on the ground without interim treatment? Absolutely, but not always at scale, and certainly not as safely near homes. And so that, going back to that first piece and going to that question of, and the 21st question is in NEPA, same thing, is that no action alternative doesn't mean things are going to be great 10 years from now, right? That's something we have to accept and be able to analyze for and understand that doing nothing doesn't mean nothing will happen. And so how do we develop those action alternatives that are reasonable in approach, based in science, and use mechanical treatments first, be it thinning, be it mastication, be it something else, so that we can achieve prescribed fire at scale.
Thanks for those comments. Those are great. The format here is in just a little bit. We're going to open it up to the public. I would ask that anybody that wants to ask a question that has a soft voice to raise and wave for the mic. Otherwise, please try and project so everybody can hear it. I'd like to ask each of you, it seems like we're at an inflection point where things have really gotten critically bad, and everybody, the public generally knows that, although we've seen sort of the public sentiment decay after catastrophic events. It only lasts so long. The legislature's interest in solving this kind of a wicked problem obviously peaks after events like we just saw in January. One of the things that I think I have struggled with, because again, you can go back 35 years, and in Yellow Pine, there was a negative feedback happening with suppression, causing disruption of the regime, changing fire behavior and changing fire impacts that were both widely regarded as understood. My question is, how do we communicate about something, about fire and how fire interacts with the things that we care about, where it affects a given fire will affect some things positively and other things negatively. And houses, any sort of fire impact is negative, and smoke is a public health thing, no matter where the source of the fire is. Is there a missing strategy in our communication that could really, I guess, and maybe I'm asking a rhetorical question and nobody's come up with it yet, but I'd like your guys' take on how do we communicate the complexities of the fire management problem in a way that then compels the public to give us the support for doing the work that I think all of us really here in this room support. Okay.
This maybe is a Zika answer here for messaging. But it's not really if something's gonna burn or not, it's just when it's gonna burn and how bad is it gonna burn. So I don't know. I mean, I'm a firefighter, but what I try to tell people is we've stopped a natural process. So that natural process is having negative consequences, some of which we'll quantify today, but some of which we may know nothing about. Maybe some disease happened because we've been putting fires out. I don't know. I can only imagine. So I think it's more about land management, ecosystem management, ecosystem health, safety of the earth, than about if our house survives the next day. So that's why I try to, that's what also keeps me going. I'm willing to stay up for 3 days on a prescriber if I gotta do it. You gotta be behind this, and that's what I think you're gonna find out is, how do we get people to accept that risk, accept the smoke, accept some discomfort, so that it's for the overall benefit of our earth for long-term sustainability. To me, that's what it comes down to. That's what keeps me going. And so that's why I take the risk. That's why I'll pull burns off if I gotta pull them off. I'll plan whatever I gotta do. I'll get community support to make stuff happen because it's that important to me. So it's a generational thing. What's this place gonna look like for our kids? Even if we have the best house, if there's no trees, no water, is it really worth it? So I don't know if that answers the question. Jason?
Yes, as my friend Paul says, is how do you want your smoke, how do you want your fire, right? Because it's the same thing. It's not a choice if it's going to come. So a couple years ago, we did a mobilization for prescribed fire that was for several months. And we burned over Memorial Day weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, over Memorial Day weekend in an area that is reliant upon recreation and tourism for their economy. Number one industry in Tuolumne County is recreation and tourism. We were able to burn over that time period because we communicated with the public before, during, and after. We made it personal. And what do I mean by personal? I mean that we held public meetings. I went up to the Memorial Day events for a couple of the homeowners groups and sat in front of them and said, here's why we're doing this. Here's what that means. Had firefighters go out and be PIOs and talk to folks individually. Had fire chiefs from local districts go and meet with people that were concerned so they could hear from somebody not wearing a shield, well, Forest Service shield, let me rephrase. And it's getting into that community and being there to engage. That is critical. And yet there's still a time limit on that. And what I mean by that is people can handle smoke for a period of time, about 2 weeks, and they need a breath. is what we've learned over time. It's still about how do you go hard, go fast, and be willing to pull back, and then be willing to go back again, because we went back over July 4th weekend as well, same place.
I think, again, I talked about tracks, which is a training exchange. I don't know how many of you are familiar, but it's a model for what I think has to happen. And it's also what Eli doing is like really bringing back community-based learning and getting people engaged, literally at the ground floor. We held a basic firefighter course in Southern California, which was planned prior to Palisades and Eaton. It was monumentally popular before the fire and even more so after. And I don't know if we're going to get a lot of people actually engaging in prescribed fire, but they understood it. And we actually, it's typically a 32-hour course. We added 8 hours to agricultural practitioners to present. And I think just having so many voices engaged, literally on the ground, literally touching the land, getting high visibility burns where people could see, wow, it's black today, but when I come back in 5 months, there's lupin and poppies, and watching that. But I just think that the way that we change the conversations is engaging more people at the table, whoever that may be, and giving them the opportunity to engage in training, whether or not they actually draw a torch and put some fire on the ground is up to them. But I've seen this be a really positive effect in communities and at opportune times. So.
I mean, I'm thinking about the generational challenge side of it, and it's a Smokey the Bear campaign, right? It's putting the amount of resources in that went into the fire suppression and, you know, not starting fires. And it's really getting Californians to understand that we're in a Mediterranean climate. Fire is our carbon cycle, right? That is how our forests thrive, that's how they survive. And put in together the policies that back that up. I know that when I go into Sacramento and meet with a legislature that might be in an urban area that's like, well, I always just, I defer to the people that are in, the wildlands to tell me like how I should vote around fire. Well, my first question is like, do your constituents care about greenhouse gases? Do they drive Priuses? In 2020, our fires in California emitted more greenhouse gases than all of the cars driving in California for that year, right? You think about that campaign of taking every car off the road in California for a year, it's a ridiculous amount of resources. If we were able to have those fires burn at less intensity and have half of the greenhouse gases, that's like taking half the cars off of California roads. And then the other thing I always think about is tracking greenhouse gases as it comes from wildfire as man-made events, right? Because we're tracking greenhouse gases and the air quality for prescribed fire, and we're treating them as we're starting them, and that goes into our index and all, we have our cap and how much we can release and all that. But if we're not counting the greenhouse gases that are caused by wildfire, we're never going to catch up, right? But if we start counting that as a man-made event and we have those greenhouse gases, those go towards our greenhouse gas reduction goals, all of a sudden that incentivizes us to reduce those intensities of those fires, keep more of that carbon in our forests, and use prescribed fire. So those are my thoughts on it.
Well, I think one of the things that we think about a lot with the Lookout is helping people understand the limits of our ability to manage the land. And so in this kind of generational challenge of teaching the public how to perceive a fire in landscape, my personal belief is that there's no way we're going to ever manage forests at scale with mastication and logging and understory thinning, mechanical treatment. It's not possible, right? We've got this expectation, this storyline that the fact that we were able to build 500,000 miles of road after World War II and drag all the biggest trees off the landscape on our national forest somehow equates with the ability to manage an ecosystem. And we just can't do it. Right? We're not going to solve the problem with fellow ranchers and mastication, and we're not going to retreat even a fraction of the land that needs to get burned. So wildfire is going to continue to be the tool that affects the greatest change on the landscape. That's what's happening. It's going to continue to happen. And I think acknowledging that the future landscape is not going to look anything like the one we have now. The one that, by the time we get around to using prescribed fire at scale in future generations, the landscape is going to look completely different. So trying to apply models right now to an existing map of the Tahoe National Forest. Like, Tahoe is going to burn. The Tahoe National Forest is going to have their Dixie fire. They haven't had any fire there for 100 years to speak of, besides the mosquito fire. So we're going to burn up the entire Beaver River watershed in a Dixie fire event. And then we're going to have a lot of opportunity to do things in that landscape. But we're not going to get ahead of it. We're spending, so wildfire crisis strategy landscape, we're spending tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to pretend that we're going to do something about it, but it's not going to, my feeling, having grown up in the middle of the Dixie fire, and that being my home landscape where I've worked my entire career, like after you've seen that happen and you understand that there's nothing different about the Tahoe from the Lassen or the Plumas to speak of. Like, why would we think that that's not going to happen? So I think part of engaging the public is telling them the truth and not pretending that we have this kind of godlike ability to run our simulation model and then somehow magically have an outcome change in the forest. Tell the people the truth. And then take time to explain to them when these things happen, why they happened, and to divert the blame, to try to sort through. We did reporting on the Eaton and Palisades fire, and the volume of like crazy conspiracy shit was like insane. Like, we had to turn off comments on our chat. We had space lasers, and we had every possible bullshit theory that one could advance on why the fires happened and who was to blame. Like, it's insane. The media landscape is so off the hook crazy right now. So I think a huge part of what we need to do as people who understand how these things work is just calmly explain to people like what is true and what is not true. And then just, I think what Marshall talked about is, like, I was thinking on the way down, like, if you would have told people in Chester, like, 5 years ago that they would have to drive 20 minutes to be in the forest, no one would have dropped that. And we all thought that Collins Pine was like the model of sustainable forestry. The Forest Stewardship Council thought they were the model, they were certified as sustainable. But then a Dixie fire burned 50,000 acres of their land in like a day and a half. And they had to spend $60 million to buy 50,000 acres from their neighbor that didn't burn. So that tells me that the entities that think they understand the sustainability of the forest, they also need educating, because it's not sustainable if your whole forest can burn in a single fire.
Okay, we've got about 20 minutes. Again, a reminder, if you have a soft voice, to ask for the mic. Questions, comments, ideas. If you do have a question directed at one of our panelists, please identify it.
Hi, question for you guys. It seems like we kind of hear the same problems time and time again, but it was interesting to hear that some places, and I think you mentioned Stanislaus, are a lot more receptive to this than other places are. And under the guise that nothing helps educate people than a successful pilot, has there ever been any thought given to the idea of focusing resources on a community that is accepting of it, with agencies that are accepting of it, to really do it right, so that could be a template for others to see when the next wildfire comes through, to show how that community fared so much better than the others who didn't, with the idea being that it may cause more communities to be more receptive, including statewide.
Yeah, so I think to a degree that's what we're doing on the Stanislaus, is we're just leaning in and going for it, and that's using federal funds, that's using state funds, that's working with other partners to bring different funding sources to the table so that we can achieve something at scale to demonstrate that, that we can change our relationship with fire is how I describe it. And that change in relationship with fire is taking those steps on pod boundaries and interior treatments so that we can achieve prescribed fire at scale. And so going to that piece of what else can be done in terms of being able to take that model and place it elsewhere is one of the things that we need to describe is what is that cost? Because it's generally not free, right? I mean, it costs a lot of money, and so what is that cost, and then what is that workforce needed? Because one of the things that Eli talked about was that we need more people to the table, and that's on all fronts of that. On the mechanical side, as my timber CEO talks about it, we're engaging every logger within about 100 miles of the Stanislaus right now, and that's not just loggers, that's folks with masticators and other equipment. Same with logging trucks, and so we're engaging Columbia College with other partners to be able to train folks on heavy equipment, and that's one piece. We're working again with Columbia College on that prescribed fire side and that fire ecology, but all of that is frankly taking models from elsewhere that myself or some of my staff have seen, and we don't need to reinvent wheels right now. We need to grab wheels that are working elsewhere, change the spoke where we need to because that one thing doesn't fit with our local environment, and just get on with it because we don't have time. I mean, 20 years from now will look completely different if we don't take aggressive steps right now. And that goes back to 1994. Northwest Forest Plan was signed in April. I used to work on the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, north central Washington. By end of July of '94, 7 LSRs were completely wiped out. You have several districts on the Okanagan-Wenatchee that have no LSR, late successional reserve for northern spotted owl habitat left. So we need to take aggressive action now, take templates that are working and just go for it. Anyway, I hope that kind of answers your question.
Well, that question was kind of what at scale do we organize communities to do more implementation, correct? Yeah, so absolutely. California is a little different because we're dealing with private lands and trying to get communities together. The pods are normally watershed boundaries, ridge tops where we're going to stop a fire, but I've found some of the greatest successes are at where communities already self-identify or want to partner. So I try to go to every level I can go to, and where I get traction is where I usually move forward in. Where it's too much resistance, it's going to be potential lawsuit, or you just don't do it. So it's really got to be, to make this happen, it's really about community engagement, community trust, and that's hard as government and people sometimes. But that's one of the reasons I've stayed in my job so long is to try to get that community trust. So then it's a partner. I'm Cal Fire, but I'm Marshall. Hey, trust me, let's work together on this project. And then we're going to need someone to stay in my position long enough to continue that trust, at least at the government level, to sustain these programs. Or people got to have total buy-in to willing to accept risk, accept smoke, knowing that it's overall good for ecosystem health. So I absolutely.
I'm going to put on my PAO hat for a second and say, I think we have a ton of good models. We have Stanislaus, we have Bill doing work in Kuiken and the Purdue tribe, and I have great success in Santa Barbara. I work with Marshall and LNU, and it's just, we're not telling the story enough and sharing it. Psych and Marsh has been mentioned a lot in the presentations this morning. We're just not sharing it enough. And I think we need to get better at messaging and sharing it. And I'll even speak personally, I tend to post less of my burns recently. I'm worried about perception. I'm worried about liability or being a target. So I think part of this conversation is how do we share these success stories and make and normalize it, But yeah, I think there's a lot to draw from there, so I just think we also have to really celebrate the successes and be okay with that, and take the heat like you were talking about. I think you're good at sharing.
Questions or comments? Will?
Let's have a real talk about what's gonna change liability. Because to me, explain to me how fire suppression has avoided going through NEPA. How did that happen? And then when you look at fires like the Slater fire, you know, Pacific Power is gonna get sued for tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. But they're providing a public service to a town in a 100-year wind event. That's like the trigger to the gun. The bullets in the gun are the fuels on the landscape from fire exclusion and fire suppression. So where does the real liability lie? How would that change the game if the Forest Service got sued for $150 million? They had to sue themselves for their cost to suppress the fire. And then when we went after gross negligence as a standard in California, we were told by the politicians that the tort lawyers just would not let that happen. So when do we get the political balls to give us the tools to bring fire back to California?
We're all jumping for the mic. That's fantastic. I mean, working with Fire Forward and other people doing great work in California in burning and hearing the whole vineyard and not being able to burn because of smoke taint to grapes and all of these different things. My first question was, well, when are these communities going to sue the vineyards when the wildfire comes through because these projects can't happen, right? And so I think it's a community thing where we need to get our communities that are saying exactly what you're saying is, no, this is our collective faults for not managing these forests in a way. And I think that's where we need to get into the buy-in, and then it's the legislation. I think it's just around like with air quality too. We need to, especially in these WUI areas, we need to be recognizing that we should be held liable for not managing these resources. And it's not the park fire is same thing in terms of the amount of conversation around the ignition source of that fire, of a guy pushing a car into a ravine and it starting the fire, and everybody's just up in arms. This guy did this thing. This guy did this thing. It wouldn't have. That fire was going to happen, right? And it just happened to be there was this nice scapegoat of a person that had some mental challenges, throwing this thing into a ravine. But really, that's not the story. The story is the fuels and the system that we created in stewarding those landscapes that created that crazy fire. So yeah, I don't have an answer, except I agree, and I think that it's getting our communities to demand what you're saying.
There was an ad campaign a long time ago, I think it was a muffler company or something, but the tagline was, "You can pay me now or pay me later." And I've used that. I think, people kind of do understand that there's a feedback between putting fires out and fuel accumulation. We see these things manifest themselves in really catastrophic outcomes. I think maybe we need to put a very fine point on it with estimates of actual dollars of damage to really get the notion of how do we get the balance of sort of a proactive approach to dealing with landscape fire and managing fuels at the same sort of a level of intensity and investment that we've got in suppression. There was a question here.
Marshall alluded to it, as did Lackland, Australia, earlier this morning. Given the great risk involved for wildfire and also the liability, to what extent can or does consideration for maintaining important habitat elements such as snags, downed wood come into play, or can it come into play given the situation? Can there be a balance of risk with conservation of these important habitat values?
I think when I think of that question, I think of the need to burn bigger units. You know, if we're only burning 50-acre units, a huge proportion of that unit is the boundary where we've got to snag it. And for firefighter safety, you know, we don't want to drop burning snags on the people out there doing mop-up. But if we do a 5,000-acre unit, then the actual perimeter is really a minuscule proportion of the burned area, and you can have snags in there. You got other less impacts beyond the fire.
Yeah, and that's what I was gonna say as well. They're not, I think the term mutually exclusive, meaning that you can't have one without the other. So as we go to bigger plots, that's gonna be increased diversity in how things burn, both severity and intensity. And so there may be islands that don't burn. There might be stuff that burns at 2 a.m. in the morning versus 3 o'clock in the afternoon versus where we ignite it. And that's kind of my situation I'm in. I think we've got to think about the next generation prescribed burn, where we just go light the top of a ridge, let it back down for 7 days, and then we staff it with 2 people or something, and we're running a whole canyon out. And during that time, the fire does a bunch of different diversity, and you know, maybe it goes out in some areas, maybe it's high severity in other areas, high intensity. We got to get to a different level of prescribed burning, because right now, it's, oh, we want to burn 5,000 acres. Well, let's call out the helicopters. Let's call out the unmanned aircraft. Let's get all the ignitions going because we want it to burn as a vacuum fire so we ignite more. How about, hey, we just take our time and let it do its own thing and burn through the night, burn when it rains. You know, and that's how I think we create the habitat, create the diversity, and really try to mimic what a natural wildfire would have done with lightning caused or whatever the natural ignition was, realizing we may have to do some work ahead of time to reduce risk. But it's definitely, by having wildfires burn in the middle of summer, wind-driven high intensity, we're making it more of a binary fire versus having high diversity fire.
Other
And the
questions?
pods will be around just for these burns.
Yeah, just one follow-up on that. I think not to burden us with more impossible chores, but that we really have to educate. We have to expand our the public's tolerance of high severity. You know, I was talking to Sue Busari, who's kind of a veteran Forest Service fire leader, and she said, well, prescribed fire is not a precision tool. You know, if I go out, you know, if I'm going to use a timber sale or a thinning, I put paint on every tree I want to take out, and I decide I'm going to take out 50% of the trees, and I take out those exact trees. And with prescribed fire, we might take out 50% of the trees in the stand, and they might all be in 2 acres out of 100. Because that's when the wind was blowing for 10 minutes the wrong way or stronger than we thought. And so part of the challenge of getting to larger burns is getting to a point where the public looks at a hillside that's got 50% trees killed and doesn't say, oh man, they really screwed that up. It's like, well, maybe that was our intent. We've got way too many trees in the forest. And so just getting people on that basic messaging that like, hey, like as Will said, our creeks are running too hot, our fish are dying because we've got too many trees on the landscape. We want to kill trees. We can kill them with a chainsaw with precision. We can kill them with prescribed fire with less precision. But it's just not physically possible for us to go out and like hand thin 80% slope in the Mammoth Mountains. You know, and that's a lot of places that we're going to have to use prescribed fire. There's places where we don't have the ability. What's it like? Something like 30% of the national forest land in the Sierra is actually suitable for mechanical treatment. The other 70% is places that we're going to have to put fire in there. And places where it's not safe to, you know, hand light mid-slope on 70% slopes in the, you know, the canyon of the North Fork of the, you know, Tuolumne or something.
Yeah, I think that it goes back to the Mediterranean climate and fire being part of our carbon cycle. And to me, it's doing it in the prescription and at this pace where you just trust fire, right? We're talking about respecting fire. It's also trusting. And you know, some of the larger trees that we've killed in a burn that, like, oh wow, I didn't think that one was going to go. I didn't think that maybe it wasn't the intent. When you take a closer look, it's like, yeah, that tree was ready to go. Fire chose it, and the rest of the stand's going to be more healthy, even if there are a little bit smaller trees around there. So there's been a number of times that after a fire, I've looked and said, okay, that didn't meet exactly all of our intention, but to this day, there hasn't been a prescribed fire that I have lit that I regretted. in terms of that stand. When I look at the alternative, number line 22, what would have happened if we wouldn't have put fire in? Coming back a year later, every single thing that we've lit, I feel better about that forest than if we hadn't put fire through it.
So it's noon, and I just want to check with Autumn, if we use about 10 more minutes or something, are we good? But we'll still leave enough time for the logistics and the turnover. Question over here.
Yeah, so it seems like a lot of things that have been talked about today kind of all come back to community buy-in or just community education about the issues. So do you see any movement by regulatory agencies or even people who provide grant funding for us to be able to provide more wildfire ecology education early on? Because it seems like youth is kind of that untapped community buy-in that we need, and that seems like a really big missing piece.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I can speak for our UC California State Parks. We are delivering that and putting together programs that include school children to come visit state parks to talk about fire. As far as other opportunities for that, California Workforce Development grants and other grants, they generally include like messaging and community outreach. So those have been really key in getting the messaging out. I just think that it's really hard to compete with catastrophe. But I guess that's when you have to have those difficult conversations with your kids about what's happening. But yeah, there is outreach, and I think we could do a better job as a whole in the state in education. But kudos to everybody bringing their kids to prescribed fires. That's huge.
After the campfire, about a year after the campfire, so 2019, we developed a fish and fire program for 4th and 5th graders, and the first class we had out there was at Paradise Elementary School within the fire footprint, and really teaching them, working with actually mental health providers as well on site, and teaching them the resiliency of nature and the need for fire to move through these systems, which was really empowering. What I see in higher education a lot is as new universities or other universities or programs want to start an arm focused on fire, focused on ecology, there's kind of pushback of like, oh, well, we don't want to compete with this other state system or this one. And to me, we need to be teaching this in our schools at every single university, every single high school, every single grade school. This needs to be part of our curriculum, just like English is part of the curriculum, right? This is how we steward the lands that we live on. This is how we steward the lands that we require to be healthy mentally and physically. And so to me, it's really, it's taking that next step and building it into curriculum and making it mandatory in all of education from kindergarten through college.
Do we have any questions from the north flank?
Yeah, over here. Hi, I think one thing in these conversations around pace and scale is that cultural fire sometimes can be, unintentional. We get a little bit pigeonholed as, oh, that's, it's great, but it's smaller scale. It's not necessarily seen as a part of the picture of what's going to get us where we need to be in terms of pace and scale. And I think that's a loss, not only to tribes, but to everyone in California. So I'd be curious to hear what you all are doing in your work to support tribal sovereignty and increase tribal access to land and fair use. We'll talk a little bit about SB 301, which is great. Something I'd like to hear more about. Thank you.
First, I want to recognize that there was that pace and scale, right? And these were, our partners, the tribes that were here before had fire at pace and scale. I mean, anywhere from 8 to 12 million acres a year burned in California. We have a few million acre year, and it's like the most crazy wildfire year we've ever seen, right? And we burned maybe a few 100,000 acres on top of that. But thinking of that 12 million acre mark, so it is looking back and learning and partnering with tribes. For us, we have 4 positions that specifically work on tribal engagement and tribal relations, because we recognize the importance of that in the way that we steward our land and having it be culturally informed. And I remember getting into this position and realizing as I'm building grant budgets that tribal consultation was the only consultant I've ever heard of that it was expected not to pay them. It's like tribal consultation, that's just something that we do, check it off a box, but they're consulting, they're giving knowledge. So what we've also done is that every single grant that we go to write, we automatically earmark 10 to 20% across the board to support our tribal partners. And then based on the project, that might go up or it might go down. That's just the baseline we put in immediately. And then we have conversations with the tribes in terms of bandwidth and their interest in the project and those things. And not only has it allowed us to increase the pace and scale, but really provide the knowledge for the future land stewards that come through our program that is necessary to get to where we need to in California.
Yeah, so again, we have the Senate bill with co-stewardship on state lands, which is monumental and really excited to see where that goes. But I think as a whole, the prescribed fire community is doing a really, working really hard to build those relationships that, we need. Sometimes we're doing prescribed fire with cultural objectives, which is different than cultural burning. And I love Don Hankins' word, power diversity. And I just think it's all of us saying, we need all of it. All of it is good. We need cultural fire, we need prescribed fire, we need managed wildfire. It's what we need. Success story from San Luis Obispo, Cal Fire's SLU and state parks. Worked in a training exchange with North Chumash, my TT tribe. And we actually were able to burn it even around a cultural site. For them to burn. It was a cultural burn. So we burned basically around, and they were able to go back by themselves without anybody being there and do a multi-generational burn. So I just think there's no one way to do it. There's just really bringing people to the table and honoring that knowledge that they have and doing what feels good to them. But again, I'm a bit of an optimist. I do see that happening all across the state, and I'm just really glad to see that.
I think, when I think of pace and scale, I still think that it's going to happen during wildfire. And if that's our assumption, then figuring out how to engage tribal communities in that sort of framework is really important. And that's part of the story that I think Will didn't have time to talk about with the 2023 SRF lightning complex is that the tribe was deeply involved in it at a tactical level, and the team that came in was really open to that. And one way that I was thinking of that is that when an incident command team comes to a forest, they're there under a delegation of authority and they're working for the forest supervisor. And on the Klamath, the Caddo people never ceded their sovereignty. And so for the last 100 years, the firefighters who come in are working for kind of the occupation government. And this fire in 2023, they were really working for Vicki Preston, who's a resource advisor, young Caddo woman who I got to know working with Will on treks. And the Caddo has really put a lot of emphasis on training resource advisors and figuring out how to work with the incident command teams. And so we really have to expand that. We really have to expand tribal engagement in that process because, these are the folks who are going to decide whether or not a dozer line is going to go through this ridge line that has got historic villages on it or sacred, medicine man walking paths. And that it's just important for us, I think, to be mindful that we're not going to be burning 100,000 acre units with prescribed fire anytime soon, but we will be burning 100,000 acre burnouts on something like the Dixie Fire. That's where the work is getting done. And so figuring out how to better integrate tribal people's input, that's a lot of relationships that have to get built before the fire happens. Because this was what Eastern command team, like folks from Maine and Maryland and stuff, and out on the Klamath. And so we have to have these official kind of mechanisms to plug in the locals into incident command system for them to have any sort of legitimacy with the incoming kind of command team.
We have time, Dave, or are we trying to get other questions in?
I was gonna try and get, yeah, both. We're gonna go to 15 minutes.
I'll give you the simple answer then. CAL FIRE is willing to cooperate at any level, whether it's permitting all the way through during the response. And I can talk more about that later if needed.
Okay, one last question? Please.
This is maybe speaking a little bit to increasing large-scale cooperation between CAL FIRE and the Forest Service, as well as within the Forest Service generally. We hear a lot about, like, the Cerro project, for example, happening very much within sort of the center of the Stanislaus. I think some of these areas that we forget about sometimes are sort of on the fringes of all these boundaries. One area that's important to me personally, just because I love the landscape, is the McColmy River watershed, specifically North Fork. That is not only just a very important watershed from a hydrological perspective, it's the, PG&E has a 19 dam hydroelectric project in that watershed, but it's also the boundary of the ADU and the TCU for CAL FIRE. It's the boundary of the El Dorado National Forest and the Stanislaus National Forest. And so it seems like it could also be a place where there's a lot of public-private partnership and cooperation to examine a landscape that has, it will probably also burn in a Dixie-sized configuration, similar to the Yuba. You go look at the upper reaches of that, there's a lot of beautiful matrix forest. Above the Calavera Stone, for example, some of the most beautiful old-growth sugar pines I've ever seen across this entire state. I was just camping there this weekend and staring up at those pines, and they're in danger. They're going to die probably within the next decade, if not 20 years, if nothing is done to really bring resources to those areas that have a lot of potential to continue to support people in good ways.
Need to have you do some more advertisement for us. That'd be great. Actually, the tallest pine tree in the world is on Calaveras Ranger District, 183 feet. And so yes, exactly. So the McColmy River watershed through the Upper McColmy River Watershed Authority, UMRA, is helping lead an effort between the El Dorado National Forest and Stanislaus National Forest to analyze the McColmy Amador Calaveras Forest Health Resiliency Project, or MAC project for short. And that would go from about Highway 88 all the way down to the northern portion of Cerro 2.0 project area. And it's to address that fire risk on 88 and Highway 4 is generally what that is. So 260,000 acre planting area, just counting Forest Service lands. And so that's underway right now, and really trying to push that accelerator button on the analysis, because we have to get not just to a NEPA decision, we have to get to the work being done after it. And so UMRA is working with other partners to start lining up funds. There was a project on the El Dorado that was kind of that precursor, and it's again about let's just go. And one of the pieces that I would say is that that old saying, don't miss the forest for the trees, right? And so my saying there is, let's not lose the forest because we're having concerns about individual trees. And that goes to, if we lose some trees in prescribed fire, it's all right. Is it okay? What did we learn from it? How do we move on? If we're wringing our hands about thinning the wrong tree, let's get over it, because we need to get to things. And so what are those raw constraints, and let's move. And so how do we get to a let's move piece? And going back to that question earlier about using models to be successful elsewhere, is how do we move so that we can really start running, so that we don't lose communities, so that we don't lose habitat, so that we don't impinge dams and critical infrastructure with clogs of debris and mud and otherwise. So that project's coming soon. Good advertising.
Yeah, and just to wrap here, I will optimistically say I think that the POD framework is really provides an opportunity for busting down those kinds of boundary siloing planning efforts. If you look at the wildfire as your problem statement, you can define that pretty well in space, and it inevitably covers lots of ownerships and management units and interests. And you get those people at the table and start to articulate the nature of what that problem looks like. And it may be next year and it may be 12 years, but it's gonna happen. We can point to really sound, past evidence and modeling to give credibility to that. Then you've got the group that needs to come together to basically, solve the problem that is transboundary foundationally. So that we basically used up our time. We have lunch for you all. Hopefully the conversations continue with lunch, but please give a hand to the